Hello, everyone, and welcome to the annual meeting of the Friends of Korea for the year 2021. Friends of Korea was started by former Peace Corps volunteers to South Korea, and the organization is dedicated to enabling mutual understanding between the two nations and enhancing cultural awareness of Korea in the United States. Though I must say, shows like Squid Games and groups like BTS are doing a pretty good job of spreading cultural awareness as well, but we also are doing our part. Now, the Honorable Ambassador An Myung-soo, Consul General of the Republic of Korea for Houston, regrets not being able to attend live. Originally, we had planned for an in-person meeting, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we were unable to do so. However, he has sent us a recorded greeting, which we will play for you now.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to join you for the 2021 annual meeting of Friends of Korea. I'd like to give my gratitude to President Jerry Krozik, the board, and all the members of FOK here today. And I especially thank Ambassador Greg Engel for inviting me to this event. It is unfortunate that we have to meet again virtually, as we are still fighting against COVID as we did last year. But as global community have been combating together to overcome the pandemic, I'm sure in the near future we will soon go back to normal life. Friends of Korea is composed of Americans who served as Peace Corps volunteers in Korea from 1966 to 1981. These over 2,000 American volunteers are invaluable friends to Korean people. Your dedication did not stop when you left Korea. It still passes on through numerous activities of FOK. I appreciate your efforts to deepen the understanding between our two countries, such as holding academic seminars and promoting Korean culture to Americans. I look forward to today's keynote address by Connie Chung Joe, the CEO of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And I also take this opportunity to congratulate the 2021 Kevin O'Donnell Award winner, Mr. Kim Jong-chan, a retired protocol officer and interpreter for the Korean National Assembly. These days, I am proud to be a Korean more than ever in my career, which spans 4 decades, and feel blessed to work as Consul General in Houston. As you know, Korea has become a full-fledged democracy. It is the 10th largest economy with 6th strongest military capability in the world. Korea's success not only shines in politics, economy, and defense power. I also like to emphasize the Korean cultural phenomenon that has captivated people's minds around the world. You know about Korean pop artists, BTS and Blackpink, Korean movie Parasite, and Korean drama Squid Game. Through your ties to Korea, I believe all members of FOK feel the same way I do. 78 years ago, heroic Korean national leader Kim Gu said he wants Koreans not to imitate or follow other countries' culture, but rather inspire and lead the other countries culturally. Now we see Korea has proven its mettle to the rest of the world. I support FOK's efforts to increase the awareness between Korea and United States for the past 2 decades. I appreciate your continued interest in Korea, and I hope next year's FOK 20th anniversary can be celebrated in person. I wish you good health and success in all your endeavors. Thank you.
So thank you, Ambassador An Myung-soo, for that wonderful greeting. Again, it is unfortunate that we were not able to meet in person this year. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce myself since I'll be emceeing the meeting for today. My name is Danny Kim. I am an assistant professor of Asian history at California State University in Fresno and a member of the board of directors for Friends of Korea. And I'd like to introduce next the president of our organization, Gary Kursich, who will give an introduction for our honored plenary speaker for today.
Thank you, Danny. And thank you, Ambassador An. We appreciate your kind words and you're taking time to prepare and record your greetings to Friends of Korea. Welcome, everyone, to the 2021 annual meeting. It's nice to see so many members in attendance tonight. We're glad you're with us. And remember, if your schedule allows, stay with us for our annual membership meeting starting at the conclusion of the public program that we have now. One note, during our public program, please use the Q&A feature for questions that you have. Now, it's my pleasure and honor to present our featured speaker tonight, Ms. Connie Chung Joe. Connie is the Chief Executive Officer of Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles, America's largest legal and civil rights organization for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Prior to joining Advance Justice LA in August 2020, Connie served as the executive director of the Korean American Family Service Organization for 11 years. Under her leadership, KFAM nearly quadrupled its budget and staff with culturally and linguistically responsive services to immigrant families, particularly those struggling with mental health, domestic family violence, and acculturation stresses. And that's where we first had the pleasure of meeting Connie. Prior to joining KFAM, Connie was a public interest lawyer for 7 years. She worked at the Housing Rights Center in Los Angeles, representing clients in fair housing cases, and the American Civil Liberties Union in Chicago, working on, immigrant rights, reproductive rights, and post 9/11 racial profiling. As you can see, Connie's an expert and an advocate for addressing the needs of the API communities. If you'd like to know more about her work, please visit their website at advancingjustice-la.org. So without further ado, here's Ms. Connie Chung Joe.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you all today at Friends of Korea. I have known Friends of Korea for many years since I was at KFAM and had the opportunity to meet folks like Nancy and Jim in person back in the day, and it is a great honor to be invited to be your plenary speaker today. So I'm going to share my screen, and bear with me for 1 second. Okay. All right. So as was mentioned, I am the CEO of Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA. Advancing Justice LA is an organization we have about 85 staff in Los Angeles and Orange County, as well as a policy person in Sacramento. And we are the nation's largest civil rights and legal service organization dedicated to the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, which I'll refer in shorthand to API moving forward. Advancing Justice LA is actually part of an affiliation of 5 independent and separate nonprofit organizations that use the brand Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and we all use the orange logo. So I run LA's affiliate. There is affiliates in San Francisco, DC, Chicago, and Atlanta. And although we are all separate organizations, we come together and work very closely to advance the rights of Asian Pacific Islanders in this country. And particularly now during this pandemic and with the rise in anti-Asian hate, we've worked very closely together to have a national presence and voice for the API community. So a little bit about our organization. Advancing Justice LA was founded in 1983 by Stuart Kuo under the name Asian Pacific American Legal Center. the organization was started in the wake of the murder of Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was a Chinese-American man who was in Detroit, Michigan, and was beaten to death by two white auto workers who blamed the Japanese automobile industry for the economic demise that was happening. So despite the fact that Vincent was not Japanese, he was of Chinese descent, and he was an American, he was targeted. And after his death, there was a trial. It was a trial for a hate crime. And the two men who had killed him ended up receiving a fine of several $1,000s in community service, but no time in jail. And what that did, it was really a period that galvanized Asian American activists at the time in the early 1980s after what had happened. I will also mention another person from our organization, our former litigation director who was with us for about 15 years, and that is Julie Su. Julie was our litigation director who worked on a famous case back about 25 years ago involving Thai workers in El Monte who had been working in sweatshop conditions and really had been enslaved in this apartment where they were working and not allowed to leave. That case was the first case of modern day slavery in America and led to changes in laws and things like the T visa that we have today to recognize human trafficking and to provide remedies for immigrants in those situations, as well as leading to sweeping changes in labor laws and sweatshop laws, both in California and in the country. Julie went on to become California Secretary of Labor and now is the Deputy Secretary of Labor under the Biden administration. So what Advancing Justice LA does, we serve about 15,000 clients a year with direct services, particularly in legal areas like immigration, citizenship, family law for domestic violence victims. And then we also do other work around policy, and we have an impact litigation unit. And we do work around demographic research, voting rights, and right now with redistricting. What's important to know is that the Asian Pacific Islander community is a very diverse community. We have, of all communities of all racial groups in the country, we have the greatest disparities between the haves and the have-nots, which I'll go into a little bit more later. We have more than 40 different languages spoken. 40 different ethnic groups that speak more than 30 different languages. So it's an incredibly diverse community. And I will say right now, what we've been really focused on is the rise in anti-Asian hate as our community has been scapegoated during this pandemic. So according to Stop AAPI Hate, there have been over 9,000 reported incidents of anti-Asian hate. However, we know that really is just the tip of the iceberg. There was a Pew Research study during the pandemic of Asian Americans, and in their survey, 45% of Asian Americans who they surveyed said they had experienced some sort of incident associated, negative incident related to their race or ethnicity since the pandemic began. Now, there are over 20 million Asian Americans in this country, so we're probably looking at far, far more than just thousands, but those are the ones that have been reported. Now, why is there such underreporting? Well, there's a couple things you need to take into consideration. One is the diverse languages that I mentioned. You know, if people don't speak English as their first language, they are not necessarily comfortable contacting police or their local government agency or social service organization to report something that has happened to them in English, especially if they have experienced trauma from it. So that can be one, language is certainly one challenge because most places aren't able to accommodate all of the diversity of the Asian Pacific Islander languages. The other challenge is cultural. Particularly when we saw, for example, the seniors who were being targeted, it's really hard sometimes to get folks to report what they experienced, especially seniors and especially immigrants. There are certain cultural values that you'll see that in Korean and other particularly East Asian cultures, where the thought is it's better to keep negative things quiet. We don't air our dirty laundry. If it's unpleasant, we stay silent and we move on. And that will become challenging in this time when we're trying to get people to speak out and share their stories about being targeted. I will also mention that we know women, Asian women, were targeted 2 to 3 times more than Asian men in Stop AAPI's hate reports. And then LA County Human Relations Commission actually just released their hate crimes reports for 2020. And in their reports, they said that hate crimes against Asian women had increased by 5 times in 2020 compared to the year before. For Asian women, I will note that there are additional barriers to reporting, even though they are also being disproportionately targeted. And those include, when I was speaking to one Asian victim, I asked her, what got in the way of you feeling comfortable reporting? Because she said for many hours, she was grappling with the decision of whether she should share her story. And she noted 2 things. One was, she said, I was scared I wouldn't be believed. And in fact, when she put her video out on Instagram showing this man just really verbally berating her after he had made a pass at her and she declined, he just called her these terrible names. And she was afraid that if she posted, people wouldn't believe her and they would accuse her of being a liar. In fact, there were some trolls who did say, I think you just staged this for the publicity. And then the second thing that she noted was, I was so humiliated. This was the most humiliating experience in my life. And, I mentioned that because at KFAM, I did work in domestic violence and sexual assault. And working with victims of gender-based violence, I know, those were 2 common barriers that I heard from our victims a lot as to why they didn't want to come forward. So it's interesting to note that for Asian women, whether you are being victimized because of race or because of gender, those barriers of the shame, as well as the fear of not being believed, are very present and they can get in the way. So let's talk about why we saw this escalation in hate against the Asian community during the pandemic. Well, first, we did have rhetoric that would refer, we had folks in high profile positions who would refer to COVID-19 as the China virus or the Wuhan virus and Kung flu. And by doing so, they really tied the COVID-19 with the Asian American community or the Asian community, and really therefore put a bullseye on the backs of Asian Americans who were now scapegoated and blamed for what was happening. But I will note that this actually follows a historical pattern and practice we've had in this country, where when America feels threatened, whether it's by foreign affairs or virus or other things, we often will scapegoat Asian Americans and blame them for what is happening. And that is something that is known as the perpetual foreigner myth or the forever foreigner myth. It is because Asian Americans are viewed as outsiders and not quite to be trusted. And so it is why when you look at the kinds of things and the comments that people make in these hate incidents and hate crimes, so much of it is Asian Americans who are seen on the streets and they're told, go back to China, leave our country, you're not welcome here. It's why someone like my father-in-law, who was walking down the street early in the pandemic, was called racial slurs, even though because he is of Asian descent, even though he is a US-born American citizen who's actually a Vietnam War veteran. But Asian faces, to a certain extent in our history, have never been seen as truly American, and so it was easy to scapegoat us. So I'm going to go through a very quick history lesson to kind of show how this pattern in practice works. So we have in 1871, there was a Los Angeles massacre where a mob of 500 people lynched over a dozen Chinese Americans in Chinatown, Los Angeles, something that you don't really hear very much about taught in the history books. And then you had in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. It is the only law that barred immigration in this country to a specific ethnic or racial group. And it was later expanded to include other Asian people, including Koreans and other Asian countries as well. I will mention even before the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was the Page Act that targeted Chinese women to bar them from this country with the assumption that they were prostitutes and coming here for sex work. In World War II, you had the incarceration over 120,000 Japanese Americans. And then I mentioned the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982. And in 1999, there was the killing of Joseph Aledo in Los Angeles, who was a postal worker. And then after 9/11, it was Islamophobia and the targeting of those in the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities after that. So really, there's been this cyclical in the Asian American community of when we're targeted, and then it goes away, and then there are periods where. So what I will also note is, in addition to this forever foreigner myth that has been challenging and caused challenges for our community, I want to note that the Asian American community also suffers from something called the model minority myth. Now, for those of you who may not know the model minority myth, the term model minority was coined in 1960s by a professor who wrote an article in the New York Times. And this was, of course, during the period of the civil rights movement. What he said is, Asian Americans are the model minority. They are smart, they are hardworking, they're studious, and they assimilate so well into this country. Now, and that at first glance, it seems like a very complimentary kind of stereotype or generalization to make about Asian Americans. The problem is when you kind of dig deeper into it. What has evolved from that is, and what has been implied is, Asian Americans, you are doing so well, and you've assimilated so well, and you are so successful. So what is wrong with you, other communities of color? Why aren't you able to succeed and lift yourself up by your bootstraps, the way the Asian American community has done in this country? And so the model minority myth has actually been used as a wedge to really kind of wedge Asian Americans from other communities of color, particularly the Black community, and to create this hierarchy. What the model minority myth also does is it obscures that racism against the Asian American community, and it hides and renders invisible the needs of Asian Americans in this country. So I think when the pandemic first hit and we started to see violence in the Asian American community, well, first I will say people didn't really notice. It wasn't reaching mainstream media attention. So unless you were following more Asian American outlets or social media, you might not have heard as much about, a man being stabbed at a Sam's Club in Texas, a woman in New York having acid thrown in her face, that all of these hate incidents happening. But then I think we really all started to hear about it when a man was shoved and killed in Oakland. And then we saw, of course, the mass shootings in Atlanta, Georgia, where eight women were killed. 6 of them were Asian American and 4 were Korean. And this was because the man had targeted 3 Asian spas to shoot. So what happened is people were shocked. Most Americans were saying, I would have people saying to me, where did this come from? This has never happened before. This is coming out of nowhere. And I think, unfortunately, people didn't realize that actually there is a history and a pattern of targeting Asian Americans, and that we do suffer from racism and prejudice and discrimination as well. And I think it was a wake-up call earlier this year, especially after Atlanta. And I think the model minority myth plays into that, in that it sort of hid a lot of that history and the discrimination that our community faces. And also, as I mentioned, it hides the true challenges and needs of our community. So what many people see is they see the doctors and those at the Ivy League schools, and they see the Asian Americans there and think, well, it's true, Asian Americans are doing so well. But what you're not seeing is that actually there is a huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots in the Asian American community. Amongst all racial groups in this country, in fact, Asian Americans have the highest disparities between those with high socioeconomic outcomes, with high school and college attainment rates, and then those who do not. Excuse me. Now, part of the reason for that large disparity between those who are doing well in this country and those who are not has to do with immigration patterns in this country, right? It is different when America opened its doors to Koreans and Indians in South Asia in the 70s and 80s. They were opening its doors to those who could come here with professional visas and come as engineers and doctors, or Filipinos coming as nurses. So we were handpicking folks from professional backgrounds to come here. And so it's natural to think that they had higher socioeconomic opportunities compared to other groups, such as if you came here after Vietnam War and came here under refugee status from Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia. That's a very different demographic of immigrants who are being invited to come into this country. And so those different immigration patterns has led to some of the disparities. But I will say, even in the Korean American community, which overall, when you look at income levels and educational levels, are higher than average for America. What you will see is in our community, there is a lot of disparity as well between the haves and the have-nots, but you just don't know about the have-nots. Having worked in social services, I can tell you that an estimated 15% of Korean Americans in this country are undocumented. And if you are undocumented, many folks are really living under the radar, working for jobs where you're getting paid cash under the table. And so they're sort of a very hidden community. Koreans, because they had disproportionately higher number of small business owners, had the highest uninsured rate of any group before the Affordable Care Act. And I can tell you that the levels of depression, suicide, and alcohol abuse in the Korean community is actually disproportionately higher than what you see in mainstream American community. And so a lot of this is hidden because they're impacting the immigrant groups or those who are lower socioeconomically. And so you don't hear about these, and Koreans are less likely to seek help for these kinds of challenges. And so you don't know about it. But in fact, there is quite a large amount of disparity in our community as well. So what is being done about this level of anti-Asian hate, and what is Advancing Justice LA doing about it, and then what can be done and what can we all do? So I will tell you that our organization has been involved in public awareness, providing direct services to victims of anti-Asian hate, and being involved in policy. So we helped push the state to pass an API equity bill that was over $150 million for the first time ever, specifically targeting the Asian community in this response to anti-Asian hate. And we're also collecting data, and we will be putting on our website, using 2020 census data, our demographic research project, where we will have reports that will disaggregate the data by different Asian and Pacific Islander groups and break down how each of those communities are doing when you look at socioeconomic, education, language access, housing, and all of these different factors, and using the 2020 census data to do that. I will mention that we have multilingual helplines in 6 Asian languages and dialects, and we'll be adding a 7th language of Hindi next. And this is the most comprehensive or most robust language helpline out there to respond to anti-Asian hate. And so we have people calling in to tell us what they're experiencing. Then we have victims advocates who can hold the hands of victims as they navigate resources, whether it's applying for victims of crime benefits, filing a police report, getting language-specific counseling services and that kind of support. And then we have lawyers on staff who can provide legal representation. And then we have a network of private attorneys who can help with pro bono support as well. So when we think about specific legal assistance that we're providing now, particularly for anti-Asian hate, I will mention that we are doing a housing protection and eviction defense program. So we know that the eviction moratorium, there are many across this country that have been there to protect tenants, but as they're being lifted, we anticipate floods of evictions that will be happening. And we want to both, one, protect our community members to keep them housed because, the homeless situation in LA and really in so many parts of the country is becoming such an issue, and it does impact Asian Americans and Korean Americans as well. But we're also looking to screen out for potential racial animus by landlords or managers in trying to harass or evict their tenants. So when the pandemic first began, I was still at KFAM and we ran a Korean bilingual domestic violence helpline, a 24-hour helpline. And somebody had called a helpline who was a single mom with a child. And she said, my manager or the landlord just said he wants me out of the building because he doesn't want me and my son spreading COVID. So this sentiment ran high, but when there was an eviction moratorium in place, you couldn't act upon those feelings. But now with the moratorium being lifted, our concern is that folks who have been having this feeling now can act upon it. And we're looking to protect folks from that kind of discrimination. Now, when I mention homelessness, people often think that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are not homeless, and that's not a problem in our community. That, in fact, is not true. Homelessness just looks different in our community than in other communities. So I can tell you, having worked very closely in the Korean community, when homeless, we worked with some folks who lived in homeless shelters. They don't go to mainstream homeless shelters, because when you go there, you're stuck without anyone who speaks your language, and there's not usually much support. And we've heard of folks who ended up in homeless shelters where they were wandering around for days and no one could speak to them. No one even knew what language to speak to them at, and there was no one on staff or anyone else could help them. So where a lot of Asian, including Korean, homeless people end up is they end up in smaller, either they end up in smaller, like below the radar kinds of shelters, such as churches will sometimes open up for some homeless people to come in to sleep in their pews. There are some very small private homeless shelters that we've seen spring up in places like LA that don't get any government resources. It's really just by donations from the community who want to help out. Korean homeless people will sometimes stay in jjimjilbangs, which are the Korean spas, day spas, because they're open 24 hours a day, and you can pay like a $20 fee and you can stay there overnight and you can take a shower and get cleaned up. And so it's not that we don't have homelessness and then the other thing is you will sometimes see an apartment, a very small apartment where you'll have 3 or 4 families crowded in there together to be able to afford rent. So it's not that housing insecurity is not happening in our community. It just looks different than, the tents on the streets and maybe what you see at other mainstream homeless shelters. So we are doing a public awareness in Asian ethnic media to let people know and to encourage them to report if they've experienced hate, because we know that we are going against certain challenges like cultural barriers and language barriers. And then also we have public awareness announcements in English to really try to change the hearts and minds of the general public and around our community. I mentioned some of the policy work that we are doing. And I do want to mention bystander intervention trainings. If you are someone who is looking to see what can I do right now in this time of anti-Asian hate, we encourage you to sign up for a bystander intervention training, which is a 1-hour free virtual training you can take on Zoom, where you learn what we call the 5 Ds. And these are the strategies that you can use to help support an Asian person should you witness them being harassed or targeted in any way. I will just very quickly go through what those 5 Ds are. The first is distract. Can you create some sort of indirect distraction that will help diffuse the situation? So if I'm walking down the street and I hear somebody speaking in sort of an agitated way to an Asian American, as I walk by them, I could pretend to drop my coffee or drop my purse. And for a second, when people see that happen, that disruption will cause everyone to look and just to see what the commotion is about. And sometimes that momentary disruption is what's needed to help diffuse the situation or provide that person, the Asian victim, with an opportunity to get away. So the second one is delegate. Can you find somebody who is a person of authority and get them involved? So we've heard on buses where Asian Americans have been targeted, especially seniors. If I were to see something like that, I could go up to the bus driver and say, hey, you need to pull over the bus. There's a situation back here you need to deal with right now. The third is document. Capture the details so you can be a witness to the event. Or if you're safe to do so, you can pull out your phone and you can capture what you're witnessing right then. Just make sure that you get permission from the victim before you post it anywhere publicly. Fourth is delay. After the incident is over, go up to the victim and say what you can do to support them. When I talked about the Asian woman who had been victimized before, after she had been targeted at a restaurant and been called all sorts of terrible things, she said the scariest thing for her was actually leaving the restaurant to go back to her car because she was afraid that the person who had been harassing her would be waiting in the parking lot to re-engage her. And the fifth one is direct. If it is safe to do so, you can go up and speak directly to the person who is being harassing and tell them to stop. So these 5 strategies, you can pick and choose whichever ones feel comfortable to you to use. But the idea is that you have these tools available. So should you witness something happening, you can you have the tools to help out. I will say that, when we were seeing the height of the violence against our community, I was hearing many Asian Americans saying that I am more scared of walking outside and of being attacked than I am of catching COVID-19. And I think it's a very sobering thought that for Asian Americans, as we were outside just in the streets and in our regular environment, we were more fearful for many of us of those around us in our public places and that we interact with all the time than we were with a virus that has taken the lives of over 600,000 people in this country. And so I encourage you to think that this is not something that we can just delegate to law enforcement or elected officials to take care of. Really, this is an environment and a culture where everyone can play a part in creating and supporting Asian Americans, and really with those around you and in your spheres of influence to reach out and say that I support you. What can I do to help? How are you doing? And we need to create that environment that we tell others that we are here to be allies. So again, it's the bystander intervention training. I encourage you to reach out to people around you and let them know, whether it's through social media or through direct connections, that you are here supporting Asian Americans and your colleagues, and creating spaces where it's safe to say that and to talk like that, whether it's at work, in places of worship, or your neighbors. And then I would say the last thing is to get education around the Asian American history. People don't really know what's happened to Asian Americans in this country. And if we don't recognize that history, how do we break that cycle from repeating itself again? So I'm going to finish with this quote from Grace Lee Boggs. Grace Lee Boggs was an activist in Detroit, Michigan, married to an African American man, and she was of Chinese descent. And you know, I want to share that for me, when I was working at Korean American Family Services for 11 years, it was a beloved institution. And I actually thought I was going to be a lifer and never leave. And when I got the opportunity to take over as CEO of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, I actually declined the invitation to come over 3 times. What changed the 4th time? The pandemic, and 2 things that happened then. One, it was the rise in anti-Asian hate as I saw my community being scapegoated and targeted for violence. And second, it was soon thereafter, it was the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement that really raised a reckoning in our country around systemic racism and anti-Blackness in a way that I'd never seen. And, you know, certainly not when I was starting out my career as a civil rights attorney. And, you know, I said to myself, my kids and my grandkids are going to be learning about what we're going through right now in their history books. And when they read about it and learn about it, and they come to me and they say, what was it like? What were you doing? And it was important to me to be able to say that I was doing something as part of the solution. So I think for all of you, I think we can all recognize that we are living in a moment that is historic. And I think all of us can take some role in ownership in saying, I'm going to do my part, however big or however small, to make sure that I am showing up as an ally. I think it's important not only just to the Asian American community, but to the Black community and other communities, and show that I am learning and I'm trying to grow and I'm really trying to support the community during this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Connie Chung Joe, for your excellent talk. It was very informative. I appreciate all the work that your organization, Advancing Justice LA, is doing for the community, especially in this particularly needed time. It was also great how you contextualized some of this anti-Asian hate within a larger kind of history of discrimination against the Asian American community. And then finally, it was great having concrete steps as bystanders for responsible and effective ways to to intervene within such discrimination incidents. Now, one thing that I found that you noted at the end there, by being inspired by the George Floyd protest, was the question of has your organization had opportunities to cooperate with other civil rights movements, other minority activist groups? Because in many ways, you know, we are the recipients, the beneficiaries of the civil rights movements. You know, Martin Luther King helped get the Asian American community many of the rights that we have today. So I was wondering, has your organization found opportunities to work with Black Lives Matters or other civil rights movements?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been really you know, the silver lining of what has been a really terrible time for our community is it has led to a flood of other civil rights groups and leaders really wanting to lean in and support the Asian community right now. And so we're working very closely with, you know, groups like MALDEF and the Urban League and, you know, Caresen and Churla in building and strengthening multicultural coalition. So our organization has always really considered very important and prioritized those coalition building. But especially now, what I see is this is an opportunity to really make sure the Asian American and Pacific Islander voice is not lost in this movement. So, you know, when I think about the 1960s civil rights movement, you know, I think it was mostly seen as in terms of Black and white. And my view is now we need to have a movement that is seen in full color. It's got to include the Asian American community. It's got to include the Latino community. And it really needs to be very multicultural. Where I'm focused right now is not just about other racial, civil rights groups and racial groups. I'm also thinking about the intersectionality of race and gender. You know, I highlighted in my presentation about the disproportionate impact anti-Asian hate has had on Asian women, because I think sometimes the civil rights movement in the past, just like many other movements, have been still very male dominated. And so for me, I'm really thinking about how do we center the experiences of women of color and making sure we include that component as well. And I will say that the civil rights movement going forward is not just about race. You're seeing a lot of activism and movement around the LGBTQ plus community, and especially because younger folks who are interested and galvanized to get involved, you know, that's an issue that's very important to them. And not just to them, of course, but I think there's a prioritization of including LGBTQ plus race into the mix. And so we're really looking at how to embrace all of that.
Okay, thank you for that great answer. I definitely see how things like other marginalized statuses, including the disproportionate effect on women and LGBTQ plus communities, gives an opportunity to cooperate with communities outside of the Asian Americans themselves. So I'd like to take a few questions as time permits from the Q&A. We have one question from Youngsun Baek, who mentions how Asians are have not been considered or fully incorporated in the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative of the Biden administration. Is this something that Advancing Justice LA is involved with?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also in Washington State several months ago when one of the school districts was looking at how they defined their communities of color, students of color, and they initially took out Asian Americans from that group. And so there was a strong response that we needed to be added back in, and we were. So this continues to be a problem that our Asian American and Pacific Islanders are considered not part of the mix for sometimes with DEI. And so what we've done is we are looking at how do we push for more Asian American studies to be included. I will say our sister affiliate in Chicago, the TEACH Act, which was the first law in Illinois to require Asian American studies. Here in California, Governor Newsom passed a bill that said by 2030, every student in order to graduate high school must take some sort of ethnic studies, which was a big push. And now we're really working to say, well, what does the curriculum need to look like and what needs to be in there? So we are definitely continuing to push to make sure Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are not left out of that curriculum. And I'm going to add a link. So I added a link to our bystander intervention training in case anyone wants to look at that and register for it. We're offering them in English. And now we've started doing them in Korean as well as Tagalog, and we'll be adding Chinese and Vietnamese soon. But I'm also adding a link here to something called the Asian American Education Project. It was actually started by my predecessor, Stuart Kuo, here at Asian American Advancing Justice, but he has now spun it off into his own project. And I think it's a wonderful curriculum that's based on videos, and a lot of the videos, they're from that public PBS special called Asian Americans. It was a 6-hour special that was aired earlier this year. And so if you want to learn more about Asian American sort of history and studies, I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, thank you for that link and that information, and for the work that Advancing Justice LA is doing. Actually, even here at Cal State Fresno, we're reaping some of the benefits of that. Our ethnic studies department is on a hiring spree for Asian American studies professors, and much of this is thanks to your organization as well. So I definitely applaud those efforts. So to address this next question, this one is kind of stated on a personal note from a Mary Brood. And she mentions how she met you and your mother was had a psychiatric practice focused on immigrant children's stress. So she's wondering how this recent outbreak of anti-Asian hate and discrimination has specifically impacted young children.
Yeah, well, first let me say hi, Mary. It's nice to hear from you. I know under this, not in person, but still. Yeah, so when my mother is, she immigrated from Korea to the United States, and she is a child psychiatrist who practices here in Los Angeles. We have seen a huge increase in the stress of our Korean American children, as well as Korean American parents. And you can imagine, I mean, it's the pandemic has created so many mental health stressors for all of us in America, but that's compounded by this fear of being targeted and attacked by others in this period of anti-Asian hate. You know, so many parents were telling their kids, you know, be careful when you go out, or, you know, 할머니 and 할아버지, they're not allowed to go out and take their daily walks anymore because, you know, it's unsafe for them to walk in the park. And so for our students and for our children, it's, you know, the rates of depression, suicidal ideation, anxiety have really gone through the roof. I know in speaking with folks at KFAM, their waiting list is so high because of this. And to compound the challenge with this increased demand is that in this period of the Great Resignation, where we have a labor shortage in so many areas, that is true in the mental health field as well. A lot of the Asian mental health organizations who need bilingual counselors and therapists and psychiatrists and psychologists are experiencing a shortage. And so some people were asking me, do you know of a Korean speaking psychiatrist? Because we can't find one right now. So it's definitely been a really challenging time. And because my mom was mentioned, I just like to share personally, you know, as I was preparing for this presentation today, I was thinking a lot about my mother's experience. Now, my mom was born in 1945 in North Korea, and her family immigrated, were refugees who came down south. And she ended up being mentored by a man named Dr. Schofield, who was from Canada, and he was at Yonsei University, and he was a missionary, and he taught my mom English, and he convinced my grandparents that my mom should go to medical school. And he went back to his church in Toronto, Canada, and got them to donate money to allow her to go to medical school. And my mom was one of very few women at medical school at Severance or Yonsei. And when she met my dad there, and she told him, you know, my goal is to graduate and move to America. And so that is what they did. And for her, the experience of having Westerners in Korea and being able to see that and that impact that they had on her was profound. It is, you know, she did have interactions with people from the Peace Corps and other missionaries. And I will just say, because I know all of you were Peace Corps volunteers in Korea at a time when Korea was very, very different. You know, I'm very grateful for your service, because I think it means a lot to many people from Korea who ended up coming here and really getting, you know, a chance to live the American dream, which for my mom was so important. So.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we don't have time to address all the questions, but I think that was a good stopping point as this personal connection with the Friends of Korea as well. So I'd actually like to transition to the next part of our agenda, which is the presentation of the Giving Back Initiative. So for those of you who are might not be aware, the Giving Back Initiative was launched in the year 2014 when members of the Friends of Korea Board of Directors were looking for a way for the organization to become more personally involved, more actively involved in service and philanthropy. It makes a lot of sense as the Friends of Korea was born out of the spirit of service and philanthropy through the Peace Corps. And so the vision was to continue this through the Friends of Korea as well. And it really aims at a deeper level of engagement with many of the Korean communities in the United States and in Korea as well. And so we'd like to honor the Giving Back Initiative recipient in this meeting for the year 2021. And this recipient is Connie Chung Joe's organization, Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA. So I'd like to applaud her organization for receiving this award this year. So congratulations, Connie Chung Joe, and I hope your organization really benefits from this.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. And Friends of Korea has been a longtime friend for me personally, and with KFAM, you provided support for our mental health services in the past, and I appreciate the support to Advancing Justice LA.
Okay, thank you, and congratulations again. And so now we turn to the next part of our program, which concerns something called the O'Donnell Distinguished Friend of Korea Award. Now, the recipient was not able to join us live this year, but members of Friends of Korea actually traveled to go meet him in person. And we have a recorded greeting from them, which we will play now.
Hi, greetings from Seoul, Korea. My name is Jim Mayer. I'm one of the two vice presidents of the Friends of Korea. And today we have several people with us. We want to do a couple of things today, but first let me introduce who's with us. We have Suzanne Crowder-Han. She is the other vice president of Friends Korea. Paul Kortright, who was a K-48 volunteer. He was in Hansen's disease control. Bill Amos. Bill is also a K-48, and he was in tuberculosis control. And this other gentleman we'll introduce later. What I'd like to do first is to acknowledge the partnership that the Friends of Korea have enjoyed with the Korea Foundation. They have been just an excellent partner for us through the Revisit program. More than 300 volunteers have already been able to come back on a Revisit program. And the president of the Korea Foundation told us at a luncheon on Monday that we will have another revisit in the coming year, of course, depending on COVID. But he's very committed that any volunteer who hasn't been, he wants to make sure they have the opportunity to come. The Korea Foundation also helped to finance a curriculum development program for secondary schools in the United States. And it was just an excellent project that they helped us to be able to have. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is to ask Suzanne, who is a K-42 volunteer, started out as tuberculosis control, and then she shifted over to maternal child health care, and later on our training staff as well. So I'd like Suzanne to kind of share with us a little bit of what the Kevin O'Donnell Award is all about. Suzanne.
Yes, thank you. And I will give you some background about who Kevin O'Donnell was. Kevin O'Donnell was a successful businessman who paused on the way to the top of the metals industry. In 1966, he was going through a difficult time and was looking for a chance to do something different when he happened to read about a mid-career administrator working for the Peace Corps in Guatemala, and was surprised the Peace Corps had such paid positions. He wrote a letter to the Peace Corps about his administrative experience, and 2 weeks later, the agency hired him. He was given his choice of countries. He chose Korea because the agency would be new there and the country was rebuilding impressively. I think we're all glad he chose Korea. A year later, Kevin told his hometown newspaper, "The Koreans, they're the Irish of Asia, a high-energy people, willing to work hard, learning quickly, amenable to change, possessing a good sense of humor, emotionally outgoing. I guess that's why I feel at home here." Kevin left Korea after 4 years, but Korea was in his blood and remained forever in his heart. Back in the States, Kevin was made acting deputy director of the Peace Corps, and then in 1971, director of the Peace Corps, a position he held for an unprecedented 6 years. During that time, he used his extraordinary management skills to make sure the agency survived when a congressman tried to slash the budget and do away with the Peace Corps. After leaving Peace Corps, Kevin returned to private business in Cleveland. After retiring in 1994, he chaired several nonprofits and served on numerous boards, including the board of Friends of Korea. Kevin passed away in February 2012. His legacy of his service above self lives on through the Kevin O'Donnell Distinguished Friend of Korea Award and its recipients.
Thank you. Now we want to move on to the main purpose of our sharing with you today, and that's to honor our dear friend and long colleague, Mr. Kim, and as we refer to him as PD Kim, and he has all kinds of other acronyms that fit with him, some of which aren't good for the camera. So we would like to ask Paul Courtright, he's going to read the citation for Mr. Kim, and Bill and Mr. Kim will be able to hold the citation itself, the award. So Paul, please.
Great, thank you. And I'm reading the citation that was drafted by Chuck Hobby from K8. I would like to submit this nomination of longtime language teacher and training project coordinator, director, Kim Jong-chan, for the 2021 Kevin O'Donnell Distinguished Friends of Korea Award. It is time to recognize individuals such as Mr. Kim for their long, dedicated service to Peace Corps Korea staff in support of the Peace Corps program and its volunteers. There can be no more significant contribution to the goals of fostering cultural awareness and friendship between Koreans and Americans than his accomplishment of successfully preparing hundreds of Peace Corps volunteers for service in Korea over a period of 12 years. The history of Peace Corps Korea eloquently demonstrates that Mr. Kim, significantly more than any other person, had a long dedicated career of teaching and training Peace Corps Korea trainees. As every PCV knows, by his actions, he fostered cultural awareness and friendships between Koreans and Americans to an extraordinary degree, fostering that continues visibly through his active engagement with RPCVs online and during the Korea Foundation Revisit Program 40 years after the first PCV left Korea. Actually, the last PCV, not the first. Yes. Wow. In this regard, Mr. Kim was an outstanding language instructor for the pre-service training of Peace Corps Korea groups K4, 13, and 19. During the training of the K-19 group as a PSC staff member with him, I first observed Mr. Kim's remarkable teaching and interpersonal skills. Subsequently, Mr. Kim was the PST language training coordinator for groups K21, 24, 25, 28, 29, and 31. And PST project director, okay, here we go again, for groups K 36, 38, 40, 42, 45, 49, and 50. Needless to say, Mr. Kim additionally directed retraining programs for many groups and engaged in individual tutoring. Again, as Peace Corps Country Desk Officer, I had firsthand knowledge of his excellent work in PST and retraining, and of the high regard in which he was held by the Peace Corps volunteers. In sum, from 1967 Until 1979, Mr. Kim was directly involved in 16 training programs, by far the most dedicated and prolific Peace Corps Korea trainer.
Congratulations.
축하합니다.
네, 고맙습니다.
We'd like to ask Mr. Kim to share some words with us. Your notes are there. He actually had about 27 pages prepared, but he's cut it down for us this afternoon.
방금 아웃스탠딩 한국말 선생님이라고 그랬어요. 그래서 저는 영어보다는 한국말로 하겠습니다. 많은 단원들 그리고 스태프들이 존경하는 케빈 오단의 단장님을 기리는 상을 저에게 주신다는 것은 너무너무 기쁘고 영광입니다. 이 멋진 상을 받는다는 것은 무한한 영광으로 생각하면서 이는 2,000명 이상이나 되는 봉사단원들 그리고 프렌즈 오브 코리아 회원님들이 저에게 진심 어린 마음으로 주는 상으로 알고 받겠습니다. 돌이켜보면 40여 년이 지났는데도 이렇게 잊지 않고 제 인생의 제 산막을 이렇게 화려하게 장식해 주는 것 같아서 무한한 영광입니다. 돌이켜보면 1966년부터 1980년까지 여러분들이 한국에 와서 잘 알지도 못한 머나먼 극동의 작은 나라 한국에 와서 많은 고생을 하면서 어떤 사람들은 영어 중학교, 대학교에서 영어를 가르치고 그 제자들은 오늘날 각 분야에서 훌륭한 사람으로서 지금 일하고 있어요. 그리고 또 어떤 분들은 보건단원으로 한국에 와서 시골 각 보건소에서 나병 관리, 결핵 관리를 하면서 우리나라 보건 사업을 개선하고 많은 도움을 주셨습니다. 그리고 또 어떤 분들은 농촌 지역에 가서 직업 교육도 시키고 4H 클럽 활동을 하면서 많은 일들을 했어요. 그때까지만 해도 우리 한국 사람들은 미국 사람 하면 초콜릿, 추잉금을 생각하는 그렇게 생각했는데 여러분들이 와서 우리나라 사람들의 그런 생각을 완전히 바꾸어 놨어요. 미국 사람들도 고추장, 된장을 먹고 막걸리를 마시면서 김치찌개를 한국 사람들과 같이 먹을 수 있다는 것을 보여주었어요. 이것은 큰 혁신입니다. 그래서 여러분들이 한국에 와 일하는 동안에 코워커, 코티처들과 맺은 또 다른 많은 한국 사람들과 맺은 인연은 한미 관계의 근본적인 튼튼한 토대가 되고 초석이 돼서 앞으로 우리 세계사를 주도하는데 미국과 한국이 주도 역할을 할 수 있다고 확신합니다. 저 하고 싶은 말이 많지만 시간도 없고 또 지면이 부족한 것 같아서 이만 끝을 맺겠습니다. 그런데 끝을 맺기 전에 이 자리를 이렇게 마련해 주신 티모 브라이언님, 척 하비님, 그리고 수젠 크라우드님, 낸시 캐럴님, 제임스 마이어 탐장님, 그리고 폴 컷라이트, 빌 에임스 감사드립니다. 그리고 빼놓을 수 없는 또 감사드려야 될 분들은 제가 여러분 트레이닝 사이트에서 교육을 할 때 많은 대학 교수님들이 우리 훈련원에 와서 도움을 많이 주셨습니다. 그리고 많은 한국말 선생님들이 우리 한국말과 우리 풍습을 여러분들에 가르쳐 주셨습니다. 그분들에게 고마움을 이 자리를 빌려서 표시하고 싶습니다. 감사합니다.
So that is it here from Seoul, Korea. Thank you for letting us be part of your meeting today.
So congratulations again. Although, as he goes by PD Kim, was unable to attend live, nevertheless, we will convey some of your congratulations that I see in chat. We'll make sure that he receives word of this as well. Now, I hope you appreciate all that Friends of Korea has done this past year. It's been a difficult year for many of us. It's been a difficult year for the Korean American community as well, as it's facing many challenges. But in many ways, it really emphasizes the importance of engagement and a lot of the work that Friends of Korea does. And again, I'd like to thank you for your continued engagement with Friends of Korea and your continued support. So as our kind of concluding remarks, I would like to pass it to our president, Jerry Kursich, for the final remarks.
Thank you, Danny. And thank you, Connie Chung Joe, for your wonderful presentation. We all learned a lot from that. And thank you, Ambassador An, too, for your warm greetings to us. We hope to be in Texas next year in person. Mr. Kim, sincere congratulations to you on the O'Donnell Award. It's very well deserved. You've influenced and impacted the lives of so many Americans. And thank you to our MC tonight, Danny Kim. He did a wonderful job. A little virtual shout out for Danny. And thank you to our board who worked behind the scenes to make this type of program possible. And finally, and most importantly, thank you to our membership for making FOK a dynamic organization that increases cultural understanding between Koreans and Americans. Remember, if you'd like to become a member of Friends of Korea, you can join at our website, www.friendsofkorea.net. And if you'd like to know even more about our activities, please stay on for our annual membership meeting. We will start in about 5 minutes. We'll display an FOK slide on your screen until the start of the meeting. So thank you to everyone, to all of our participants and viewers tonight. Take care.